Hi, my name is Robert Guttman. Is better?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I teach economics currently at Hofstra University in New York, and I also was a professor until my retirement 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, at the University of Paris 13. I'm going to try to explain to you my thinking about the current moment as a transformative sort of junction, where we can go this way into this, so we can get towards a better type of capitalism, or we can just try to muddle through. In order for me to understand this moment better and make it also sort of a teaching moment for you, I use the international monetary system as a vehicle for comprehension. So my talk is entitled, same title as my most recent book, which just came out a month ago, called Multipolar Capitalism, The End of the Dollar Standard. And by dollar standard, I mean a particular configuration of the world economy and also its geopolitical structure that was built on US hegemony since I was born, since like end of World War II. And it is my hunch or my conviction, depending on how credible I am making my case, that this is about to end. And that we're moving into a different configuration of the world economy, also geopolitically, based on three poles that are kind of zones of influence, and they're going to be zones of influence not least by their internationalization of their currencies, which would be the Eurozone, and also eventually and relatively rapidly, I think also the China and its renminbi, which gets currently transformed into the Chinese yuan. And that makes a lot of difference to how the world economy and the politics thereof work. But choosing the international monetary system as a kind of institutional framework to discern the, shall we say, economic, monetary, financial, technological, and political dimensions of the power structure of the world, and also realizing the kind of the fact that the world economy is more than the sum of its parts. It has a whole dynamic on its own. That's not obvious in economics. You're not going to get a lot of economists like me, I can tell you that. And it depends how you look at money. First of all, I mean, it depends on a number of things, but the first starting point is always crucial when you're looking at a problem, right? So they talk about the national system, we better have a sense of what we mean by money. And the dominant view about money, I mean, I'm going to give you three different views, right, that we kind of play around with in social sciences, if you will. There's money as a good, then there's money as an asset, and then there's money as a social institution. And those three views bring you into totally different directions of how you look at the world. So the dominant paradigm, you want to call it new classical economics, you want to call it new classical economics, that's different names. But the mainstream is money as a good. And that has certain implications right away. It means, for example, that as a good, it is separated from all the other goods. So there's already going on since David Hume, basically, that's 1752, this kind of separation of a monetary sphere and a real sphere of the economy. And that presumes that these two are separated, money is neutral towards the real sphere of exchange and production. And that's how you get equilibrium analysis. You cannot get equilibrium analysis with the money inside of the economy. You have to evacuate it from the economy. Our equilibrium conditions, money supply, supply equals demand, or the production function and optimization, all of these are stated mathematically as non-monetary phenomena. You have only a physical production function, for example. You treat exchange as if it was barter with money just as an accidental deal, putting this somehow together. And then as a good, then of course the question is how do you integrate those two spheres, and that's the equation of exchange, and that gives you a sort of a unidirectional relationship between the money supply and prices, the nominal GDP. That's the equation of exchange. Within that framework, there is no international economy as such. Okay, there is none. I've been teaching international economics for 43 years. Right? It's a very straightforward, as everything in standard economics, linear aggregation. Right? You just aggregate people into markets into general equilibrium, and also countries into the world economy. In standard economics, the world economy is the sum of its parts. All the national economies together. 198 countries put together, they're connected to each other through the balance of payments. And out of the balance of payments positions of the countries comes another connection, which is the exchange rate. And that's all there is. In standard economics, you're looking at the national economy just from the point of view of a national economy, as it is connected to the rest of the world. Through the balance of payments, which is an account of all the transactions going on between one country and the rest of the world. You can have it bilaterally between one country and another country. You can have it in the aggregate, doesn't matter. But that, the balance of payments is purchases of goods and services and assets by foreigners. That's your demand for your currency. And then, the supply is your purchases for the rest of the world, and then you get an exchange. That's an incredibly limited view, right, of what's going on in the world. You can also then, and this is kind of the great achievement of Keynes, but Keynes, came to this in a very circumventitious way. You can look at money as assets, as an asset. Look, I can talk to you a lot about Keynes, and maybe if you're interested, we can talk about it later, but here, the key thing is to understand a particular quality of money vis-a-vis other financial assets. So we juxtapose this to bonds. So you have a choice between money and bonds carry interest, money does not. Why would you want to hold money? And the point is that there's a special quality to money that's international liquidity preference. The liquidity preference. And so here's a much more sophisticated view of money demand than the original approach that I mentioned that money is a good. With money is a good, the only money demand motive, the only reason you want to have cash is for transactions. But in Keynes's world, opening up money as an asset, you get additional demand motives, right? And they're unstable. You have the precautionary motive, you have the speculative motive, you have the finance motive. They're all cyclical. So Keynes embeds in his view of money already a sense of instability. It's the opposite of equilibrium analysis. In a very consistent fashion, when you look at Keynes's development and his views of money, he writes like 5 books on money, okay? Starting with Indian currency, the first thing that he ever wrote in Economics, 1919. All the way to the moment he faces kind of the 40s, he works out an international monetary system. The Bancorp Plan, which insists on having supranational payment system with a supranational currency. And he does that because he warns that using a national currency as international money is going to be a problem. And it is. Later, this became the Triffin dilemma. There's different configurations. You can figure out why the dual role of money, the currency, of a national currency, both as its national currency as well as the primary intermediate international unit of exchange, is going to be a contradiction and asymmetry. So he works out this idea that that's the Bancorp Plan, that you have a supranational form of money, which he calls Bancorp, emitted by an international clearinghouse. And that also works. It's just a public system. It's not a private payment system, right? So it's completely controlled publicly, right? And it works out rules of adjustment between surplus countries and credit and deficit countries that are kind of balanced and symmetrical. I mentioned this in some detail because one of the scenarios that may unfold or may not is that we have to go into that direction. And that once the hegemony of the US dollar ends, which it will do over the next 5 to 10 years, then the chaos that may arise from competing money blocks, from a fragmented international monetary system, may force us into this direction. Also, if in this geopolitical rivalry, let's say between China and the US, we forget the fact that we're all a species together and we're thinking we need to have global coordination, then you need to establish a much, much powerful global coordinated mechanism with a new type of global governance coordination that even if you're enemies, you can't afford not to have because you would otherwise kill yourself. So these ideas that were born by brilliant minds thinking about this for the whole life, like Keynes for 50, 70, 80 years ago, these ideas may have been utopian then, but they may be good ideas for the 21st century. But there's a long history, and I fell into it like I fell off a truck. But when I was, your age, I got confronted with Marx, and I got confronted with a moment where I had to understand how international money works when I was 19 years old. I was demonstrating. I was a student activist. I looked like, long beard, long hair. I didn't look like a really effortful student. And I was taking my first class in economics, my second class in economics. And there was this professor, Erich Streissler, and he looks at me and he says, "You over there, I saw you yesterday. Why were you screaming, 'I don't want to pay for Vietnam'?" And students like, "Hey man, it's Streissler, if you piss him off, you never have a job. Go on, tell him." And he said, "Well, those leftists, they have no clue what they're talking about." He was the leader of the Austrian School of Economics. I emphasize, he was a student of Heidegger. He's still alive. He's now 88 years old. Right? But anyway, he made fun of me. And then he said something totally strange. He says, "You know what? You were right. What you were screaming is correct. And you don't even know it. Figure it out. Thursday, 10-page paper." I'm like a second-year student. Then I fall apart inside. I hang in there. I wait for students to get out of class. I go to him and I ask him, what do you mean?" And he said 2 words: Bretton Woods. Then, 2 of my friends go with me. We go to the library. We figure out Bretton Woods. We figure out that it all runs on US deficits, and that includes military spending. We figure out that that's how we pay for the Vietnam War in Europe. And I write a paper, and he loves it. And then he just sends me away when I need to go away. I have a choice to go to Columbia or Wisconsin. Little things that happen to your life that just like explode you into a different direction. So Bretton Woods. Now, 9 months later, Bretton Woods collapsed. And that really got my attention. That was in August 71. From then on, I've been thinking about this. Okay? From then on, and I had another great experience with Ernest Mandel came to the University of Vienna like a rock star, a Marxist rock star. You have to see 4 days on long waves. So then somehow, very early in my life, I was incredibly lucky. Things got put into my head to think about. So let's go to the first graph. Slides. So when you're talking about money as a social institution, right? First of all, that's a very rich approach, right? And it's an interdisciplinary approach. It's as interesting, and Marx himself is interdisciplinary, but you can read The Psychology of Money by Georg Simmel, incredibly interesting German sociologist. economic anthropologist Karl Popper. There's a lot of very interesting work on money as a social institution. It's a social institution because we invented it to regulate our relationships of interdependence and conflict with each other. Now, there's a lot to be said about how money got invented, and I don't want to go there because that gets us into all kinds of heterodox debates about what money is within the context of a social institution. That's a whole other lecture. There's different views. But the important thing about, there's several important things about, in my view, when you think about money as a social institution. First of all, it is human-made, it's man-made. By man, I mean human. Okay? It's invented by us, and it changes as we modify. So we change money and our arrangements with it. And so one of the things that's interesting here is the money form. The money form is interesting. And the money form is interesting not least because the form of money is going to have a certain amount of influence on how you regulate social relations. It has to be inserted into the economy. And it gets inserted into the economy as a payments system. And most economists never, ever, ever think about the payment system. It's like when you go into your bathroom, you never think about the plumbing behind the wall. You just automatically half asleep, turn on the water, do your shower or bathtub, and it's just like a circuit, okay? But the circuit is driven by this incredibly complex pipe system with joints and pipes and everything behind the wall. And because it's automatic, you never think about it. Of course, when the pipe breaks, you got some problem. Then you know how important the pumping system is. But if you go from paper money to digital money, you're going to have a very different payment system. Okay? And that also means that how money gets issued, circulates, gets distributed, gets measured, there's value, all of that is embedded in the payment system. How we pay. And this includes contracts, okay? Because monetary relations are contractual relations, because we have simultaneously confront each other when we are buyers or sellers, workers or worker capitalists, creditors or debitors. We're always depending on you for our income. Your spending is now my income. That puts us into interdependence, okay? The monetary constraint. You're going to live your whole life chasing that monetary constraint. You get up in the morning, do shitty work. You cannot buy unless you sell. That's the monetary constraint. Everybody has that. But we regulate that. So your spending is my income, and then also that sets us into conflict. Because your cost, you want to have, your spending is a cost. You want to keep it at a minimum. Price as low as possible. This is my income. I want the price as high as possible. So we have contracts. And we have contracts also in a kind of much more interesting way, which is that the other part of our economy, I'm talking about the monetary circuits, right? Everything that we do, all economic activities are monetary circuits that are interdependent, both horizontally and forward in a forward motion. So both in space are then interdependent between buyers and sellers, or the markets, financial markets, creditors and debtors, and so forth, right? But also, you cannot make more money unless you spend more money now. I spend the money now, right? So for you to grow investments, you have to invest, you have to spend money now in order to make more money later. And so, but later is not the same as now. Later is uncertain. So there's a time value of money. That's another whole other question. That means that basically money now is more worth to you than money later, and that you can make a favor of interest out of that, if you will, as a compensation for that. But you can compounding and discounting, all of that. But the key point is not that. The key point is that you're not only trying to take radical uncertainty and turn it into measurable risk, which is very different, and you know the difference, but you also try to regulate as much as possible that gap between the radical uncertainty and the possibility of kind of control, measuring risk in terms of feasible outcomes. So not do we only have contracts between us, but we have also contracts for time. We have forward money contracts. Okay. And in capitalism, we're developing more and better forward contracts by the minute. I know exactly what my salary is going to be in 2026, thanks to a collective bargaining agreement between my union, the Professors Union of America, called AAUP, and my university. That's a forward money contract. My apartment is insured. That's a forward money contract. If I worry about gas prices, I can buy gas futures and oil futures, that derivatives. That's a forward money contract. Once we have digital money, we multiply forward money contracts by a factor of, I don't know what, 10, 100, a million. When you have smart contracts, wait and see. But the idea here is this. When you have a world of international relations, when you have a world where you go beyond the national space of currency, given that currency is part of the state, there's a dimension. There's always several dimensions to money. There's a private dimension, a public dimension. But the public dimension is that the state has control over the unit of account. The state says, we're not talking about reais here, we're talking about dollars. So when you land in New York, like I will in a couple of days, all my reais are going to be worthless. Sorry. I have to change them. And if I change them there, it's not a good place. That's part of the international monetary hierarchy. When you go to America, come with the dollars, okay? Because they give you a bad deal. They don't need your money. But anyway, that's just my personal complaint. It means I have to go. All my excess reais have to be exchanged before I leave, probably tomorrow. They give you worse rates, much higher charges. There's an asymmetry to the real, the dollar. But anyway, I'm getting lost. I don't want to be lost. The point is this: money then has, an international existence, because by the time it goes to the other side of that circuit, it's a different currency. So you always have dual transactions. Not only money against goods, services, and assets, but also money against money. And that complicates matters. And that's why you get the international monetary system to organize that. You need something that goes beyond national. You need something supranational or transnational. You can't have a world economy without that, without money circuits being able to move beyond borders into a different currency. So when you take it from there, I don't want to take too much time, right? But when you take it from there, then you get an international monetary system, right? And the international monetary system in all its configurations, which start 5,500 years ago, with the Code of Menes, first bimetallic standard, establishing the pharaonic dynasty, using actually metal money to invade Lower Egypt. That was the idea ultimately, right? Because once you have metal, you have two things. You can force down their throats, whoever it is, with weapons. Your metal weapons are going to be better than those bows and arrows, or spear, whatever. But also money. You can force metal monies, specifically assign metal money, and make that the organizer of economic activity in that locality. So the first bimetallic standard is right. It's an incredible moment in history, because you get, for the first time, you get antique powers. Happens in three places at the same time, not just the Code of Menes. It also happens Sumer, which is then Mesopotamia, which is then Babylon, which is a place that becomes eventually Iraq, which was still bombing the old cities there. And Sumer and Nineveh, bombing. The Americans have bombed twice within the last 30 years, old ruins that were the oldest cities in the world, like Ur, who comes That's the city of Abraham. Metal money appears there too. And then China. It's all about rivers too. It's along rivers, the Nile, Euphrates and Tigris. And then in China, you have three rivers going east-west, Pearl, Yangtze, and Yellow rivers. We figured out boats very early until we could exchange. But for exchange and driving exchange into territorial control, you need metal money. That was very useful. Anyway, there's a great history, and that's all I'm saying. To go beyond that, right? More modern, the characteristics of international monetary systems are complex, but they're primarily the acceptable forms of international medium of payment. Right? The world community is not inclined to accept money that they don't know much about or that they don't have great use for. When the Israelis are buying Volvos from Sweden, they could pay in Swedish krona, they can pay in Israeli shekels, but neither party will accept the other. Okay? If they, the Swedes get the Israeli shekel, they say, "What the hell? Why do I do that? What do I do with that? I buy Uzi machine guns, but I'm home." So you have this was much easier with metal money, but it's even true today that you have this in the use Keynes' expression of the international liquidity preference. There's going to be a global kind of agreement as to acceptable forms of world money. Okay? And until not so long ago, this was primarily, and it still is, primarily the US dollar. There was a conference in 1944, July 1944, called Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is actually a place. I went there. Looks like a Haitian wedding cake. My wife is Haitian, so we always joke about that. It's like a gaudy palace, in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. But there they met 44 countries, and they agreed to make the dollar world money backed by gold. That was Bretton Woods. So you have the forms of, then you have a payment system that goes with it. You have exchange rates, exchange rate regimes. How do you manage exchange rates? That's a crucial question because that defines the insertion of your economy into the world economy. That's your umbilical cord that gets connected. But you have to manage it. That's again, there's a public-private dimension that's very important here. Right? So there's not just exchange rates, but in this view of money as social institutions, you have the exchange rate regime. And then with the exchange rate regime, you can have a spectrum from all the way from free floats, managed floats, crawling packs, adjustable packs, currency boards, and then dollarization or euroization, whatever we're going to look at. So there's a lot of variety. But depending on the variety, you also get a payment system. You get modalities of convertibility, exchange controls, capital controls. Who actually is allowed to go and move the money across the borders? That's the particular strategic position of certain banks. I'm talking about this plumbing system that you never look at, okay? But it's like fundamental architecture of the world economy. And it only comes to our attention when it doesn't work, right? Or when something happens that we need to fix it, then it becomes different. Right? But then there's also the technical aspects of the payment system that are crucial. Like for example, do we have a banking system that's controlled by national governments? Do we have a banking system that is internationally organized beyond the control of central banks, which we actually got after 1960, with the currency market? Do we now, as we move to central bank digital coins, do we do this through the banks? We don't have to do it through the banks. China is saying, wait a minute, everybody's already paying online and they're using Tencent or they're using Alibaba and Alibaba Pay, or they're using the tech giants of China. They're now like the new banks. So how do we design this CBDC, this central bank digital coin? You have plenty of options, but they all come down to a payment system. You're going to create a payment system that's on the internet, right? That's digital coin. That's embedded in a new type of economic activity called the digital economy. But you're going to have different types of internets. You're going to have the Chinese internet, the European internet, and the American internet. That's already developed. Which also means that there's an interesting question about variance of capitalism. So that's already a different view of international monetary system. Mind you. All right, that's enough. Let me go to the next one. All right, yes. So historically, you can see that you have had consecutive international monetary systems, right? What interests me most from this dimension of the money as social institutions are two things. The money form, and what that means. And I'll see in that slide, I'll show you what that means in a sec. But I'm also interested in something that I noticed because of this early story with Bretton Woods, right? My life, 19, 20 years old, and then Bretton Woods collapses, and it's like a big crisis and all that. And that's like the first time I'm paying any attention to any of this. There is crisis. There is a cycle. There is a cycle that gets you to the crisis. Then you have an after-crisis process, right? So there's something going on. And when the moment you start thinking about international, you see that there were international monetary systems, they were in place, and they worked very well for a while, 20, 30 years. And then there was a crisis, and then they didn't work well at all. There was chaos. And then after a certain period of chaos, there's a crucial moment. And we are at that crucial moment right now, right? There's always a crucial moment when you have to rebuild this thing. And rebuilding is not natural. It's not like it comes like that. Okay, rebuilding means either war, and then whoever wins sets the standard. You know, that's like England beating Napoleon, and then the Congress of Vienna, 1815, or that's Bretton Woods, 1944. Well, that's maybe 2032. Xi Jinping is like smiling at whoever's the American president, says, "See you later." You know, it's possible. One of those scenarios. But it can also come about in a different way, right? We've had other, but it takes a hegemony, right? Usually you get out of one period of turmoil, post-crisis turmoil, into a new reformed system of the international monetary system because there is one power that can set that can make that happen. You need a hegemony. There was Britain in the 19th century. There was the US throughout the second half of the 20th century into the early 21st century. But now we have a problem. We don't have an hegemony. You know, how do you create a system that can accommodate ménage à trois? In an odd way that's simplified by the invasion of Russia, you know, the Ukraine, because that sort of created a bipolar pressure cooker, a binary pressure cooker, where there was a system that was fragmenting in all kinds of levels. Okay, so now we have again two worlds. It's much more complicated than that, but we can organize politically for a while in a crucial period of transition, as if we were just two poles. This depends very much on what's going to happen inside of the US. Okay? And there, my God, I live in New York, but I also travel around the rest of America. It's a wild place right now. More on that later. The difficulties of having a multipolar system is a question of coordination. Okay? You need to coordinate if you don't want to have too much instability. And you need to have the proper private-public mix. Public means finance systems are controlled by central banks. and central banks in some kind of relationship with their governments, okay? And they shape this. And private is typically finance, right? Financial dimensions of the international monetary system. And there's banks, and then there's markets. There's different financial structures, right? And they're also quite different between China, for example, the European Union, or America. So that's another one where you get barriers of capitalism in three different models. They're very different models of finance, I can tell you that. And it gets juiced up even more nicely because we're moving towards different types of finance. We're moving, for example, towards climate finance, sustainable finance. And we're moving towards crypto finance, which is definitely decentralized finance, and so forth, right? So we'll see how that plays out. So you're already beginning to see that this is a very complex moment. Okay? And there's also not a lot of good ideas. There's the global governance institutions we have put into place with Bretton Woods, which barely survived the transition from Bretton Woods to the next system, which was the dollar standard. I mean, I'm talking about the IMF, I'm talking about the World Bank, I'm talking about the World Health Organization, I'm talking about the World Trade Organization, I'm talking about the World Health Organization, because we're going to also have many pandemics to come. You know, all these global governance institutions, they're from a different century, literally. They're not adapt to this multipolar, highly fragmented, potentially adversarial world. But anyway, I'm talking too much, sorry. We have to get some kind of ideas as to how this works. So we have to look at historical patterns. That's what I insist on, right? So one of the things that's historically, and I want to make that point very strongly, but also very briefly, there's a lot more to the story, is the dematerialization of money, the progressive dematerialization of money. Dematerialization is the right word. Money loses it becomes virtual. It loses its physical presence, okay, over time. It's less and less physical in that sense, okay? And that actually means a lot, because when you have just metal money, I mean, we had agrarian money. That's a whole other complexity. And actually, for 8,000 years, we just had agrarian forms of money. I don't want to talk about that because that disappeared 5,000 years ago. And it's prehistoric. We just speculated. We have something, the Code of Hammurabi, written like in 1571 before Christ, is a legal code which moves you from Mesopotamia to Babylon. Hammurabi has a new dynasty, and he lays out a code, a legal code, and there he discusses agrarian money versus metal money. Quite striking, I can tell you. The guy knew about inflation, for example. But anyway, we don't know much about agrarian money. Metal money. Metal money is like a metal barrier. You depend, it's money because it's precious, it's scarce, and it has intrinsic value. And it was always a problem it was a very crude type of money in terms of subtle human relations in a way. Right? And you had to have a convertibility regime at the center of the payment system, and there's a lot of issues about this. And then we spent lots of time in the first 2/3 of capitalism's history making that metal money system work better, and by making it a little bit more flexible, a little bit more adjustable. Right? And this is a beautiful history, but I don't want to talk too much about it. Right? At some point, we had to get rid of it. It got rid of itself in an explosion of crisis. That's 1929 to 1933. That's the collapse of the last iteration of the gold standard. That's also known as the Great Depression. And the sharp part, the brutally deflationary part, the global part, when it moved away from the US into the globe, right, was precisely when the gold standard collapsed, September 31, which then triggered the collapse of the global banking system, basically. And then trade wars and competitive devaluations, and then World War II. When you can't get out of the crisis, and the crisis gets deeper because things break after one after the other, then you have a world war. It's entirely possible that that's going to happen again. Okay. Somehow you need to get out of the crisis. Okay. That's humans cannot stand too long to be in crisis. They rather kill each other than suffer together. We're a very strange species. Okay, let's be clear about it. Point that I'm making, right, is that you have this cyclical dynamic that comes also from changing these money forms. So the international monetary system, there's a history of the international monetary systems where you go away from gold, you go into a gold paper standard. What we call the classic gold standard was not a classic gold standard, just gold. It was also just gold and pounds, but the pounds are paper. The world sends gold to London, and London sends pounds to the rest of the world. That's how it worked. After 1879, that was established as a rule book. It wasn't just for informal. That's when we threw out silver. So there's also a lot of chaos between silver and gold in the middle of the 19th century. I can talk to you about that another time. But then, then when we get to Bretton Woods, we have a paper system, and that's going to be both currency and then increasingly also bank deposits, and then the bank deposits take off when you allow bank deposits of dollars, the denominated dollars to be in London. That starts in 1959. Offshore banking. You have the euro currencies market. You then get a private system beyond the reach of national monetary authorities. You get global finance. You get a system that gets dominated by private financial interests. And they become the vector of globalization, a whole new level of globalization compared to earlier waves. Because also, next slide will show that international monetary systems work by organizing waves of globalization until they explode in crisis. That's how it works. We'll get to them. Here, one more last point. We're now going to a moment where the electronic transformation of money and finance, which started in the late 70s. Okay? When I was a kid, okay, when I was young, your age even, there were no automated teller machines. Okay? I had to go to a bank with bank tellers, and then you were waiting in line, and then the bank teller, they know you. You know, they say, Robbie, it's the second time in a row you withdrawn $500. What are you doing? Right? It's not like you go to a machine. That the ATM machines, yeah, they come, take over the system. Then it's going to be debit cards, you know. And now it's just your bloody phone. Phone talks to another phone. But we're getting to a point that's an important point, which is that you're going to have cryptocurrencies emerge. And that's a long story, and I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. I happened to write a book about this way before it came, right? So I have very strange feelings about that. Because in some moment when I didn't know what would hit me, I was writing a book on cyber cash, the coming reign of electronic money. That's in 2002. Now people are, what do you say about that? What do you say about that? I don't want to say anything. I don't know anything, you know. I don't even know how to open I don't know anything. But of course, I was trying to figure out how this works. Right? So the point is this, that the cryptocurrencies, more speculative assets, there was two types of cryptocurrencies that were like payment systems. That's Bitcoin and Ethereum. Okay. And then there is a particular type of new type of digital money, that's stable coins that can be either algorithmic or actually traditionally backed by assets that you can put in place to connect different spheres of the cryptocurrencies with each other, but also spheres of the cryptocurrencies with the regular old system. All of this is crashing right now. It's a good thing, but something comes out of this, right? The internet also had a dot-com bubble in the 90s, and then something came out of it, like Google, Amazon. Right? They were not there before, okay? They were like tiny. Google was tiny. Everybody wanted to go to Ask Jeeves and Yahoo and whatever. Right? But Google survived, the others did. And that's going to happen. But in this struggle for survival, there was an idea, and that's an idea that frightens any central bank, and that was Facebook's Libra. And that's a global system with its own, blockchain, and that terrified the central banks, and they immediately reacted and took it down. But then they realized sooner or later they're going to face that threat, that they're going to have non-banks organizing a global payment system. That's terrifying. And so then they got to work, and they're now designing something else, central bank digital coins. You're going to have to pay attention to this, okay? BIS report, second annual. I mean, you can email me, I'll give you a list of things to read about. Your teachers you can talk about. But what's important here is that this is imminent. This is in the next 2 or 3 years. And you will get first the Chinese digital coin, and then you're going to get a Euro digital coin, and perhaps an English digital coin. But the way these get organized, there's different options. No matter what the option, that in itself will take care of the dollar standard, no longer being the dollar standard. Because that will dramatically alter and augment, if I will say, the internationalization possibilities of both the euro and the renminbi, and even the renminbi without having to do the normal internationalization channels that we typically have done. In other words, the Chinese can internationalize currencies without having to deregulate their own financial system, which has always been their contradiction, since 2008 for sure. And so that in itself is crucial. But there's something else going on that's important. Yes. The international monetary system works in cycles, in long cycles. So when you look at each system that we have, those consecutive systems, the bimetallism of 19th century, and then the classical standard from 1879 to 1914, and then the Bretton Woods system from 1945 to 1973, and the dollar standard from 1982 to 2008. When you look at all these systems, right, they for a long time were vectors of an accelerated growth path. That's when you see that the world economy is not just the sum of its parts. It's more than that. It has a growth dynamic all on its own, by organizing these capital flows or trade flows, and hooking countries together in much more powerful fashion. Right? So the international monetary systems in place had a capacity to organize two things: globalization of economic activities and financial activities, one, and allowing, this is important within that context of globalization of economic and financial activities, allowing the catching up process of powers towards the center, towards the hegemon. So in Bretton Woods, the catching up was clearly there were many, but the key ones are Germany and Japan, the losers of World War II, that got completely destroyed in the process. They're not going to rebuild, but in Bretton Woods, they can catch up with the US. And typically the way this happens, there's two things happening inside the international monetary system that allows that. One is that you have always inflows and outflows. You look at the monetary circuits, but you have dominant circuits that are the engine of the growth process. In this case, these were capital exports from the US under Bretton Woods. Both military, for global military encirclement of the Soviet Union in the wake of the Cold War, but also aids and assistance that ultimately came right back to the US because you're giving people money to buy American products. But this is the Marshall Plan, for example. And then turning American companies into multinationals by letting them invest, open up for them to invest in Europe and then later beyond Europe. Right? And so you have 3 channels in Bretton Woods of growth promoting US capital exports, providing the rest of the world with dollars that they need to deal with each other. But the second thing that's also embedded in that system is that the dollar was overvalued from the very beginning against gold, so as to make it more attractive than gold. But it also means it was always overvalued against the other currencies. So the other currencies were undervalued. So if you have an undervalued currency, then your products are cheap for others. And your assets are cheap for the Americans to turn into multinational corporations. Right? So that is a growth configuration of the post-war boom. You have a similar configuration in the dollar standard after 1982, but this time it's not American capital export, but it's American trade deficits. The Americans become the buyers of the last resort. Again, the dollar is highly valued, it's overvalued, the others are undervalued. They get an export-led growth, right? At some point, the Americans absorb 2/3 of all the surpluses of the other countries as their deficit. That's like an iron embrace between two, right? Between two blocks. They're connected to each other. Okay? In that sense, you never forget that the international economy, thanks to its international monetary system, whatever that means, is more than the sum of its parts. It has a global dynamic. We need to understand it. We need to have a kind of a meta-economic revolution in terms of understanding how the world economy is more than the sum of its parts, just as Keynes had to have a macroeconomic revolution in the 1930s to understand that the economy is not just the sum of its markets. And that's a job for you to do, guys, if you're interested. Yes. Because without that, we will never figure out how to coordinate between adversarial powers, for example. Or set up a payment system that's run by technocrats who don't care about war, but also have the power to prevent it. So to go back to this idea, right, of the growth spurt, so the international system is a vector of faster growth during a certain period. But as those countries catch up, what happens? Global excess capacity. Okay. Overproduction, not underconsumption. Okay. I'm still a Marxist on that and not a Keynesian. There's a difference between overproduction and underconsumption. Take that from me. Okay. And that sets up the fragility for heavily, because in that upswing, everybody's taking on more debt, right? Easy credit, cheap money, and you're taking on more debt, right? So eventually the overproduction crisis hits you when you're already quite leveraged, and then it becomes a systemic financial crisis. Every single international monetary system since the beginning of capitalism, let's say in 1800, every single one of those 5 had, in the middle of its regime, a systemic financial crisis. Okay? In the 1873. Or in the interwar period, you had 2 systemic financial crises. First the war, then you have 1921-22, and from that comes fascism in 23 already. Duce's there, Hitler's there. Reminds me of something happening today. And which is the other thing is that politics gets shaped by that a lot. I tell you that too. But you then have the Great Crisis from 29 to 33. And then you have war. Then you have Bretton Woods. Then you have Bretton Woods breaking down. Remember I talked to you about when I was 20 years old? In 1971. By 73, the other part of Bretton Woods breaks down. And then you have a decade of stagflation crisis. And then you have the Reagan Revolution and Thatcher Revolution. You have a counter-revolution against Keynesianism. And then deregulates money and finance, money and banking, and then you have financial capitalism. And then you have a financial capitalism crisis in 2007, 2008. In financial capitalism, the US drags the world along through its trade deficits. I already mentioned that. Okay? But the trade deficits get organized by asset bubbles. You're building an investor class in the US that's like 50, 60, 70, 80 million people strong through pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity funds. You create a particular machine in the US. You're not Americans. You don't know that. I know that. I emigrated there, and then I have to worry about my private pension funds. My kids were born, set up an education fund. College is expensive. You're forced to become an institutional investor, hook client. You cannot live without it. And so you have this particular type of financialization, but the financialization drives you with Reaganomics tax cuts, which make speculation basically tax-free. You get these bubbles, asset bubbles, right? First, the stock market boom of the 80s, which are the corporate raiders, great story. We talk about that. Then the dot-com bubble in the second half of the 90s. Then the biggest one, the real estate bubble, homeowners. You can take your house like a cash machine by refinancing your mortgage, as long as the house value goes up. But these bubbles burst. And in those contexts, right, in that context of 2007, 2008, the American bubble economy just exploded. It was never the same. Trump comes from there. And he's a perfect fit for that because he's the super speculator. That in a crisis, when his ass burns and he gets, for the fifth time bankrupt, he has to find a new job. And he becomes a TV star. And then he has an idea that because he's a TV star, he can brand his name. And the best way to brand his name is to run for president. And then he gets elected. That's not what he expected. Of course, once he starts giving his fascist speeches and he gets the response, he gets hungry for that. And he turns into a politician. And he's not dead yet. He's like a cat with 9 lives. But he also has 35 million people who are willing to die for him and are armed. And I'm not kidding. That's what frightens me. To go further, right? So you have this crisis, every system, right? And then you have a process of post-crisis adjustments. You have deflationary pressures. The international monetary system turns itself on its head. And what becomes paramount now is a fragmentation process, okay? A deglobalization process. Monetary protectionism of competitive devaluations, which then lead to trade wars. Again, you have each system, you see this pattern. And by the way, the end of that analysis is that we are right now at one of those turning points, okay? What happens now? We are at the end of what Guttman sees this long waves. Because when I started, again, I told you that the other idea about long waves came very soon too because of Ernest Mandel. I listened to him for 4 days and I was never the same person. Then I knew that I wanted to be an international economist. That was like 21 years ago. So this international monetary system with its cycles, right, and this 20, 25 years of upswing, the crisis at the peak, and then the long process of secular stagnation, whatever you want to call it, right? Slow growth, stagflation, whatever you want to call it, that gets embedded into a much bigger project, which is a project of understanding the evolution of capitalism in terms of long waves. So have you ever heard of that? So that's in itself a pretty interesting history. The one who first stated that capitalism moves that way is a Soviet economist, a very important, very interesting, young, brilliant Soviet economist called Nikolai Kondratyev, who Lenin appoints in 1922 to run the Institute for Conjunction, as part of the new economic policy. Right? They were trying to they had some needs to understand things, and Conrad was beautifully placed. He was not even 30 when that happened. And then he has 60 incredibly good statisticians and economists, and they start looking at cycles. He does this longitudinal study of the French economy, the British economy, the American economy from 1850 to then, or 1800, so 1800 to then. And in each of these places, he sees long waves, and they coincide. He tries to explain them. Right? There's a beautiful set of discussions. Of course, if you are right after the Soviet Revolution, a Marxist economist who says capitalism can revive